one, is it possible to execute conjugate method without bands and chains? Yeah, definitely. Louis did it for years with a lot of success. I don't think it was till like early 2000s that the chains and bands got popular. So definitely, I think one of the, this chair's squeaky as fuck, so sorry. I think one of the big misconceptions about the program is that Conjugate is bands and chains and boards and all that other stuff. Those things are just tools in the system. The real kind of definition of Conjugate, to me, to make it real simple, is just you're going to train multiple traits within your week. So for most people, for most athletes, for most lifters, you can do dynamic method, max effort, and repeated effort method. I just kind of term them heavy, speed, and rep work. So you can still do all three of those things, and you can even change those depending on what population you're working with. So, you can train multiple traits within the week without bands and chains. Do they help? Absolutely. They're a great tool. I think they're a great tool even for beginners, which I think a lot of people don't do, but as long as a beginner is technically sound, why not put those things into place and try to get the benefits that we can from them? So you have to scale them down. You're not going to put a blue band or average band on a high school cross-country runner, obviously, right? So you scale it down. So like high school cross-country runner might use a mini band on squats. As long as you set it up right, you can get 50 to 80 extra pounds of tension on and teach them to accelerate weight and get extra stretch reflex and all those good things out of it. So it is definitely possible. It will definitely work. But I think it's optimal if you put those things in. So not necessary, but it will definitely help. Exercises to build hip strength. A lot of stuff. So typically to build hip strength within the system, we're doing a lot of wide stance stuff, which is going to help most people right off the bat because most people don't do that. So if let's say you're introducing someone new and you start them doing wide stance box squat, and when I say wide, I'm just saying relatively wide to their normal stuff. That's going to bring up their hips as long as you're doing it right. If you introduce sumo deadlift, that's going to help. And then all the accessory work that's popular, reverse hypers, back extension, anything. And when I talk about hips, I'm talking about like the general hip area. Like if I'm wearing a pair of like boxer briefs, just that whole area that's covered. That's what I'm talking about when I say hips. Because like to me, it's not just glutes, it's hip flexors, it's groin, it's all that stuff that gets built up doing some of the wider stance stuff that you don't normally do. The problem with that is people will hear like, do wide stance stuff to build up your hips, and then that's all they do. So when you're doing this and when you start to put in wide stance stuff, teach it to the point that your athletes or population gets proficient at it, but keep the close stance stuff in too. You gotta continue to train everything. Bring up the weaknesses, but still continue to work on your strength. So exercises to build hip strength, there's thousands, right? So like I said, in general, you can kind of do some wide stance stuff, do some close stance stuff. Wide's typically gonna stimulate your hips more than close stance, but don't go exclusively wide stance because over time you're gonna run into problems. It's gonna kind of beat you up. And don't just train the hips with your main movements and compound movements and wide stance stuff, groiners, seated hip abductions, really simple things, and kind of specialized or kind of isolation exercises are really good too, because they're gonna help build up kind of the smaller muscles. Okay, so it's kind of like saying I'm not just gonna train bench press and pull downs to make my shoulder stronger. I still have to do some rotator cuff work. I have to do some scap work stuff. So the smaller exercises are important too. You can really mess your program up if you go all big exercises. So there's tons and tons and tons and tons of stuff for hips. That was kind of general, but help with hip flexibility, mobility. It's hard to hit lower box squats with a wide stance. There's a lot of things that could be going on here. A lot of times people hear wide stance and they think of like Chuck Vogelpohl squatting back in the day with his feet out really, really wide. Some people just can't do that. You got to watch the athlete or, you know, lifter, whoever you're working with. If their feet are out so wide that they just physically can't get their knees out to match their foot stance width, you're probably going to have to bring your feet in a little bit, you know, so that could be going on. A lot of people are going to be able to go wider on a wide stance box squat than they are wide stance free squat. And that's just because the hip strength isn't quite there. Eddie Cohn's actually talked about this a little bit. You know, he's talked about working your stance out little by little as your hips get stronger. You can't take a lifter. You can't take a lifter who's primarily like a closer stance squatter and just crank them out super wide and expect them to do well. It's going to take time to kind of build that up. So I think when I hear questions like this, that's typically kind of what's going on. It's typically somebody who's kind of used to going close stance or free squat, and then they'll rip their stance, go way out wide, and it's too foreign to them. The hips haven't been built up over time to be out there. So this person asked about flexibility and mobility, but I think a lot of times it's almost a strength issue. Like the mobility might not be there because the strength isn't there yet. So if you kind of, you know, continue to work on mobility. Now, if it is a mobility issue, a lot of the issues we'll see is with psoas, TFL, so kind of in the front of the hip. Those things get kind of bound up for whatever reason. A lot of times because the glutes and the stuff in the back isn't strong enough to support that. Those things will bind up and grab on to try to support your body. So there's a lot going on there. That's a very general question. But I think a lot of times when people ask this, it's when they try to go out too wide for their strength levels, maybe not so much mobility. So kind of build that up slow over time, and don't expect to go from close stance free squat or like a medium stance free squat to way out wide free squat or way out wide box squat. It's going to take a little bit of time. That's why, so that's a good point. So like with our athletes, our speed days were always a wide stance. And wide was relative to the athlete, right? We got them out where they were a little uncomfortable, but we had a lower load on. So it might be 30 to 50% of a max, so they could handle that. But then heavy days we would rotate, so we weren't out there all the time. So we kind of slowly creep them up. So yeah, it's kind of a general. Best lower back stretches and warm-ups for heavy lower days. This is real general. What I've seen a lot in the past is a lot of lower back problems aren't, this is in general, keep in mind, and I'm not a doctor and like, right, but in my experience, a lot of what I've seen is a lot of lower back issues are not lower back issues. A lot of times it's like an upper glute or kind of psoas and TFL issues. And this is from a lot of personal experience. This is a lot of experience with athletes and stuff. So what I would typically do with our athletes, if a kid was having low back issues, a lot of times we'd kind of go after psoas. So a lot of times if we could get them on a softball on the floor and kind of grind out in their stomach and psoas area, that seemed to help loosen things up. Another one is if you have any fat bars, or a foam roller isn't really dense enough or hard enough, but get on your TFL, kind of the side of the hip where your front pocket would be, that kind of meaty area in the front kind of corner of your hip. Those and psoas tend to get bound up, especially with like inexperienced or untrained athletes, because everyone talks about glute function and people can't use their glutes. That's, I think, part of the problem. A lot of younger training age athletes don't understand. Yeah, I'm talking about you, Zach. A lot of not you on this, Zach, but a lot of younger athletes like don't understand how to use their, and I hate to say this because you hear this shit all the time about the glutes, but they don't understand how to use them, or they're not doing movements right is another big problem. When we don't squat correctly and stuff, we don't put the athlete in a position so the glutes can work. So what happens is the psoas and TFL and all these muscles that shouldn't be the primary movers or supporters in that movement have to take over, and they get locked up. And then, like psoas, we all know, originates at the spine, starts pulling on your spine, and you get back problems. So to go back, best lower back stretches and warm-ups. If you're having back problems, a lot of times in my experience it's kind of a psoas issue. Now for warm-ups, reverse hyper, back extension. I'm a big fan of the Dick Hartzell banded hip stuff. It's very simple. It's kind of been around for a while, but it seems to work really well. Quick, efficient. Hit that stuff up. Reverse hyper's been huge. It's been huge for me. I used to have a ton of back problems. Honestly, I don't know that I'd still be training. I know that I wouldn't be training as hard as I am right. Not that lately I kind of been a little banged up, but if I hadn't put in reverse hypers, there's no way I'd be probably even squatting today. So reverse hypers have been huge for me. I think it's been big for a lot of our athletes. Anytime you can get an opportunity to kind of traction out your spine and push blood in there is big. And then like you're training the glutes too. So that's always been a big one for us. I'm going to put up an exercise we did. I might have put it up already. If I haven't, I'm going to put it up. It's basically just a low back crunch where you can even do these body weight, where you just kind of put your feet in an RDL stance or wherever you want, and then just kind of roll your low back over and then arch up. So you're just do like a crunch for your low back. That will kind of stretch and push a bunch of blood in there too. If you don't have, you're not going to get the traction effect you get with reverse hyper, but that's always something I've kind of done before I go to bed at night and stuff to help my back loosen up. So I did it in one of my training days a week or so ago, and it's going to be a daily movement here soon. If I haven't already put it up, I can't remember. So that's a good one. Even in a group setting, if you just do a body weight, I just do them body weight, and it'll push a bunch of blood in there. So that's a good one. Watch for that. Optimal programming options or suggestions for lower body while recovering from, I think this guy had shoulder surgery. So while recovering from upper body injury, I've been here before. A couple of my athletes have been here before. I think it's important to, if you've had a surgery, take into account the stress that whole process is putting on your body. I'm not saying be a total Sally and do nothing, but realize your body's under some extra stress, so scale things back a little bit. You know, like when I had my shoulder surgeries, this isn't real hardcore, but like I took the week off. I took a week or maybe even two out of the judges, didn't go to the gym. You know, let your body kind of recover, if you have a surgery, you got all these drugs going through your body and stuff. Like it's pretty traumatic for the whole system. You know, even if it's just a shoulder surgery, your whole body is kind of fucked up from that. So give yourself a little time. When you go back in, do things that aren't terribly taxing. let yourself heal up a little bit. Now, but at the same time, like I've seen people have bicep reattachment and they're in the gym next week with 600 pounds on a safety bar. Okay, so I mean, if you're a fucking maniac and you can do that, do that. But I think in general, give your body a little time to calm down. Give it a week or two, and then when you come back in, do stuff that's not terribly taxing, and just start very low volume. You know, belt squat's a huge thing. It's been great for me, great for a lot of athletes that I've trained. We actually had a kid that had shoulder surgery, and I had something similar to myself. This happened, but this kid had shoulder surgery, and he came back, and we eased him back in, and his main movement for lower body for, I want to say 2 months, was belt squat, because we didn't want to. He had quite a bit of work done on his shoulder. It was kind of a previous injury that was there hanging on from before. But his main lower body movement on heavy day and speed day was belt squat. And we would put bands and chains on it and accommodating resistance so we could kind of switch the stimulus up. And he was on there for about 2 months, I think. And then we took another 3 to 4 weeks on the safety bar to kind of ease him back into having that stress on his shoulder and upper body. And after that 3 to 4 kind of break-in period with the yoke bar, I feel like he matched or beat a PR with it. So if you kind of structure things right, you can keep your strength right there and really not lose too much. And I kind of did the same thing with my last shoulder surgery. That was August. June. So it was basically maybe a little over 2 months after my shoulder surgery. Took my time, came back in, belt squatted in the meantime, kept up on my accessory work. Once I felt my shoulder could handle the load of the bar sitting on there, I didn't tie a PR, but I was pretty close. I was within 50 pounds in one chain or something. So that just, you know, I think people get a little antsy and worried they're going to lose a ton of strength. I think if you keep just doing stuff and doing work, and don't go crazy, you can be right there and be ready to be ready again. So optimal programming, take it easy. Ease your way back in. You got lots of time. You're not getting paid fucking millions of dollars for your lifting career for the most part. I know this guy that's talking, you know, most of us, we're not pro athletes, so take your time coming back, because if you fuck yourself up, it's going to be even worse. So that was a long fucking answer. So short answer, take your time, use a belt squat, do what you can lower body, and you'll be fine. You'll be fine. Take your time to get back. No big rush. It's optimal is going to be up to you. It's going to be what your body can handle and what you think you can get away with. Don't be in a rush. When box squatting, should your stance be as wide as possible or close to your competition stance? This is a good question. I think this is where a lot of people fuck this up. You should not be as wide as possible. Wide is relative for everybody, even lifters. A big advantage of the box squat is we can build the hips up more, okay? But if you go too wide, and I talked about this a little bit earlier, if your feet are out so wide that you can't like roll your knee out to get at least close to your foot stance, you're not going to be able to free squat. And I'm going to talk about this like a lifter. So let's say you're typically like a raw lifter, kind of a medium stance, and everybody says how great box squat is. So I'm going to go to the gym and now I'm going to box squat as wide as I can. 99% of people, if they try that and then go to the meet and go try to replicate that stance at a meet, are going to get their ass kicked. Okay? Your hips can't handle it. So use the box squat to build your hips up, but keep in mind, if you're a free squatter with, let's say, like a medium stance, you have to still be good at that. And that's where your strength is. So use the box squat if you're going to go wide to kind of build your hips up. But then in training, you want to exploit your weaknesses and attack them. When you go to the meet, you want to do what's fucking easiest, right? So when box squatting, should your stance be as wide as possible? Take your box squat a little wider than your competition stance. And then when you come back to your competition stance, your hips should be stronger and your other strengths should be there from before, and you should hit some PRs, okay? So that's for a lifter. I'm assuming this guy's a lifter, so that's kind of how I'm answering that. But I think that's where a lot of people fuck that up. Like they'll hop on a Conjugate program and, you know, go hear a 30-second clip of somebody talking about wide stance box squat or whatever, which is a good exercise, but you can't just most people can't just go wide stance box squat all the time, way the fuck out there with their feet out there, and then go to the meet and replicate that and be stronger at the meet. It's very uncommon. So it's a great tool. It's like anything in training. Don't let the pendulum swing too far one way, or just, I mean, like fucking anything in life, right? Don't go too far out in left field or you're going to be in trouble, okay? So, yeah, use a wide stance box squat. When I say wide stance, I'm not saying as wide as possible, but here's kind of a rule of thumb. When you box squat, let's say you're like a medium stance or close stance squatter, if you're going to start box squatting, set your feet out wide enough so when you go to stand up off the box, you can feel the lateral pressure pushing out on your feet, almost like your toes are going to split out the side of your shoe. That's really as wide as you need to go. You can go a little bit wider, that's fine, but to kind of get those benefits of box squat, that's kind of what I have people do. Same with athletes. So just go wide enough so you can get some outward pressure. It'll teach you to use your hips. It'll teach your glutes to fire. It'll strengthen your hips up. Make sure your knees open up. But like I said, if your feet are out too wide, there's a point where it becomes disadvantageous. It's gonna fuck you up because too many people try to go out crazy wide, and then they go to the meet and they try to put their feet out there. It's bad news, and they say, "Well, what the fuck? That didn't work. Conjugate doesn't work." Well, you got to. So, to circle back to the question, when box squatting, should your stance be as wide as possible or close to your competition stance? I think, and in my experience, it's worked pretty well to go a little wider than you're typically comfortable with on the box squat when you're far out from your meet. So we're doing GPP, and then as you get closer to your meet, start to practice your competition stuff more. So what's worked pretty good for myself and my clients, what we'll do is we'll do our speed work with our competition stance on no box, and then we'll do heavy stuff to a box with a little wider than we're used to. And that's worked pretty good. And then once you get closer to your meet, maybe everybody's different. So once every 4 weeks, we might throw in a competition style free squat. You know, for me personally, I lift in gear, so I don't need to do that. What I'll typically do, whenever I free squat in the gym, it feels fucking terrible and I hate it. Like for me, I need the meet day, like kind of juices flowing to even feel good to free squat. So what I'll do in my training, like I said, this is geared. Personally, as I get closer to a meet, I'll start doing some speed days with no box and my suit bottoms on to kind of that way I can kind of get the feel of things without loading a ton of weight on myself. But that's just me, because anytime I free squat in the gym and I start working up in weight, everything feels terrible. It just doesn't feel good. So I say, you know, I'm kind of like, fuck it. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about it. But use them both, but don't get too carried away with box squat. Okay, there is. What do you recommend using if you don't have bands and chains available at your facility? Percentages, variations, tools. So if you don't have bands or chains, kind of move. You can go a little bit heavier on speed days, basically. A lot of the stuff I talk about using 30 to, depending where you're at in the year. I talk about using anywhere from 30 to 60% on speed days. If you don't have bands or chains, buy some. If you don't have bands or chains, just bump the percentages up a little bit, maybe like 10-15%. Okay, so for my recommendations, if we have bands and chains and I'm training a speed athlete, we're getting closer to a speed competition, we'll use 30% of their max, basically, roughly. So if you don't have bands or chains, maybe go 40%. Okay, just tack 10% on if you don't have bands or chains. That's a real easy way to do it. But I mean, you can get a hold of, like, you don't need band pegs on your rack to utilize bands. There's lots of ways you can set up dumbbells and shit to get that shit done. So at the very least, I would buy some bands and figure some shit out. Like, I used to, here's an example. I worked out of undergrad, I worked at a corporate fitness facility, and we didn't have a squat rack. So I would literally, I would bring my chains in, and I had to fucking squat out of an incline bench because the hooks were set up higher, and I couldn't even max squat for the time that I was there because we had no power rack. So I would unrack the weight from an incline bench, like 2 plates and some chains, and walk that shit all the way back out so I was behind the seat and do my speed squats. So you can find a way to do some fucking accommodating resistance. Suggestions for short arms and deadlifting. Hate the lift because my arms are short. Just got to deal with it. Sorry. No, but no, I'm being a smart ass. Good question, Nick. Give me 1 second. So they got short arms. What are my suggestions for deadlift? They hate the lift because the arms, okay. You still got to deal with it, but Dave made a great point. He had Casey Williams on the podcast, and they were talking about this, and he talked about if you're not built to deadlift is gonna beat you up more. So take that into consideration when you're programming. You know, you might be built to deadlift, and a deadlift day could almost be a deload for you. Or like this guy, you got really short arms, and whenever you deadlift, because your arms are short, you're rolled over the bar more, and it kicks the absolute shit out of your hips and low back. So just take that into consideration in your programming. You still got to do it. I'm a big believer in, for a lifter, for the most part, doing speed pulls on a weekly basis. I think that's really good for athletes too. And the reason is deadlift's a great exercise to build up the total body, right? But if you're doing it heavy all the time, it's pretty rough. So like if you're doing speed where you got lighter loads, but you can still train that lift, and I've seen this. I've seen it with groups that I work with. They made great overall strength gains just doing speed pulls. So if you're bad at deadlift, that might be an option for you. And then you only do a max effort deadlift once a month or once every 6 weeks maybe. So if you're not built to deadlift and you hate doing it, you still got to do it. But take into consideration how it's going to take from your other training. Like I have friends, I have friends that barely ever train a deadlift and they're still strong as shit, but everybody's different, so you got to kind of take things into consideration. Do you recommend speed and accommodating resistance often for high schoolers? As long as they are technically proficient in the main movements, yes. The thing is, you have to scale it for them. Like I can't have a kid whose squat max is 200 pounds. I can't put them under strong bands, right? So years ago, I went back and I stole Donnie Thompson's squat cycle, and we made a lot, myself and a lot of my athletes made great gains off that, but we just scaled the accommodating resistance back. Okay, so you can do it with young athletes, and I think it works really well. You just have to scale it. So you might have, and a lot of people will tell you this is wrong, you know, but as long as your kids technically look good, you can put mini bands on to squat. If they're less than a 200-pound squatter, you can set up your mini bands correctly, and as long as they're box squatting correctly, you can put them on, and you can get a lot of those physical benefits from that tool. So why not use it? Why wouldn't you want your athletes to learn how to accelerate and all the advantages you can get off of that, right? So it's, as long as it's scaled and as long as the kids technically look good, you can do it, and it will help. This is a good question. Absolutely, anytime. Okay, how do you train aerobic capacity? You have a dynamic effort and max effort day for building endurance. How often and taxing are these sessions? So this is a good question because I think there's a lot of confusion on this. These are all when you're training these things and setting up your programming for these things, these are all completely different. We have aerobic capacity, dynamic effort, which is typically put in place to build explosive strength, speed strength, kind of in that range in our strength traits. And then max effort day. So we've typically got 3 different lanes. We got 3 different lanes that we're going to work with here. How often and taxing are those sessions? So let's start with, how do I train aerobic capacity? That's completely dependent on the athlete. So like for myself, big fat power lifter, if I go put 1 plate on a sled and grab a micro band and I walk back and forth with that sled and just do some shoulder rotation, like shoulder rehab exercises while I walk back and forth on the turf, not sprinting, just walk, I'll get my heart rate into an aerobic building zone. So for myself personally, that's a good aerobic capacity builder, right? For a cross-country runner, that might not even get their heart rate in the zone that they need. So for each of these lanes, for aerobic capacity, that's going to be different for everybody. For dynamic effort and max effort, to me, those are typically kind of set in stone. So dynamic effort, we're working on explosion, explosive strength, speed strength, however you want to term that, but that's kind of a trait that's really the same for everybody. Max effort day is kind of the same too. You're building strength. So for those, there's not going to be as much variation. Now, how often and how taxing are those sessions is going to depend on where you are in your season. So I'll take myself for example. With the aerobic capacity, if I'm not even thinking about a meet, I probably will put a little more emphasis on that. And I can make it a little more intense and do it a little more often. But as I get closer to a meet, I'm not going to train aerobic capacity to the point where I think it's going to pull from those other traits. Okay, so you only have so much gas to put in the tank. So as you're going along and you get more specific, you have to think about where you're pulling from and what the cost is. So if you're talking about, you asked about aerobic capacity first, so I'm kind of thinking maybe you're working with distance athletes. I don't know. Let's assume that. Let's assume you're talking about distance athletes. So their aerobic capacity is going to be built just through their practices, right? That's always going to be there. It's always going to be trained. But when you're kind of far out in your off season, you can put more emphasis on dynamic effort and max effort work. Whereas you get closer to your, let's say, conference championship or nationals or sectionals or whatever, you need to decide what your emphasis is and what your priority is. So how often and how taxing those sessions are is completely dependent on where you are in your training. How often? You're going to train max effort lower once a week, max effort upper once a week, dynamic effort upper, and dynamic effort lower once a week. Okay? Now, something you can do with, I'm still assuming we're talking about kind of some distance athletes, as you get closer to competition, you can start kind of doing some things that are a little more time specific for your max effort work. Like max effort work doesn't have to be a 1-rep max. We had a lot of success just doing, we kind of, like max effort was like our really hard stuff. Like they got done with that exercise or that lane, and it was like, holy shit, that's miserable. So we for example, we would, with our track kids, we would kind of do some time specific stuff where like a 200-meter runner might squat as many times as they can on a belt squat for 22 seconds and do a couple sets of that. So an 800-meter runner would squat for 2 minutes straight. So you can kind of mess around with things like that to make it more specific. So it's a good question because you can build all those things, and I think that's an area that's confusing to people. But to basically start general, and as you get closer to your sport priority or like your big event of the year, get more specific. Okay. All right. Thoughts on sled work for injured athletes? Absolutely. Yes. Dude, shoot me I would love to come down to your place. Shoot me an email. We'll get it going. Yeah, I'll go down and watch your fucking mutants train. Thoughts on sled work for injured athletes? Absolutely. I don't even with lower body injuries, there's so much you can do with sleds. It's low impact. But it's going to help you push blood. It's going to help keep the muscle activated. There's a little bit of tractioning effect if you set it upright in the hips. Yes, definitely, absolutely. If it's an upper body injury, walking with a sled is a great option. I've been doing, like with my shoulders are kind of a weak area for me, so, but I also know I need to bring my conditioning up a little bit. So lately I'll just walk with a light sled, and while I'm walking, I'll take a micro band and do a bunch of shoulder rehab movements. So I'm kind of killing two birds with one stone. I think that's a great thing. I wish I would have done more when I was coaching. Like kids that were coming back from upper body stuff, instead of just standing in the corner and doing like shoulder rehab or whatever it might be, have them walk with a sled and do it at the same time so you can kind of like, you can keep their conditioning up. So absolutely sled is, and just do it. Don't get too caught up in, well, how far do I need to go? How much weight? Just start out light, start out kind of low volume, and slowly creep things up, and it's going to help you out. So definitely, sled work is a definite. What's my assessment if a day or two after training session I'm not sore? I don't know. It's a good question. Like, soreness is not always the best. Most of the time, it's not a great indicator whether you had a good training session or not. It's I'm trying to think where this person's coming from. I don't know. Maybe my recovery's on point. Maybe I'm finally doing shit right. If I'm not sore a couple days after a workout, maybe I'm doing shit right. Maybe I'm fucking recovering and I'm ready to go for my next training session. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of things that can go into that. soreness is not your best indicator of whether a training session was good or not. You know, for the most part, I think you should be ready to go on the next training day. Wenning made a great point on this. I like Wenning's take on stuff. I think he's smart. I think I like his take on the system. And I watched his DVDs, and he was talking about, you will know your speed work and your percentages are on point if on max effort day you come in and you're ready to fucking go. Because as a power lifter, your max effort work is your main objective, maximal strength, right? So if I come in and I'm still fucked up from my speed lower day on max effort lower day, something's not right. I'm not recovered. So if I'm not sore from a workout, I'm not worried about it. Because at some point, for the most part, I'm gonna get you're gonna get the stimulus you need. Unless you're being a complete fucking sissy in your training, you'll get the stimulus. Like if you train somewhat hard, you'll get the stimulus you need. Like if you're trying to be sore, I get it. Like we train hard and we want to be sore and stuff, but yeah, that's not your best indicator. It's not your best indicator. Maybe if you're a bodybuilder and you're trying to get hypertrophy and you just want to fucking destroy shit and do a bunch of volume, maybe that's a better indicator. But for like a strength or a strength athlete, don't use that as your big thing. Slipknot. Sorry, I'm going through reading these. I'm starting to wear down. I'm not going to be on here too much longer. How much of a difference do you think you would be between a well laid out block periodized program versus Conjugate for athletes over the course of maybe 1 year and 4 years as well? Much of a difference. This is really listen, I'm biased as hell. I'm very biased on the Conjugate stuff. Difference do you think you would see between a well played out block periodized program versus Conjugate for athletes? Here's why I like Conjugate for athletes. Athletes have so many more traits to develop besides just strength. I think that's why it matches up well with them. They have so many more outside stresses on their body than a power lifter, that I think the variance in movements and the difference in training traits and just the overall variation and layout of the program, I think benefits them more than a traditional block periodized program. Now if we're talking about lifters, that can be completely different. There's a lot of lifters who do more of a traditional block model, who are way fucking stronger than me, who are really fucking strong. So I think in, like, if we're talking about just power lifters, you know, I'm still going to go Conjugate. I still am a fan of how that works, and that's where my knowledge base is, and that's where I can be most efficient. But there's a lot of people who do block stuff who are power lifters who do very well. So like there's probably, to me, there's more of an argument there for the block stuff. But for athletes, I feel like there's too much variance. There's too many other traits we need to develop. I feel like they deal with repetitive movement injuries a lot just within their sport. So I think the variance in movements in the Conjugate program benefits them more. So if that makes sense. So if they're doing repeated movements in their sport and then they come in the weight room and they do more and more repeated movements, it doesn't make sense to me. I think Conjugate is way better for athletes. But that's my opinion. But I've had a lot of experience to kind of show why I should feel that way. But I can't, like, I can't say over the course of maybe 1 year and 4 years, you know, I can't talk about that. One example, there's a few examples. One example that pops in my mind is we had I've just seen older athletes who have been later in their 4-year college career kind of come over from other stuff and start making progress again. Like they were stuck on kind of a linear model, and they come over and start doing this stuff, and the progress takes off again. Like we had a couple examples, but there's more. One in particular, we had a sprinter who was a junior, and we had the vertex set up, and we were testing the throwers that day. The sprinters weren't even supposed to test, but he walked in. He's kind of, you know, you have the vertex set up, and everybody wants to fucking jump and see how high they go. This sprinter came in, and he was a junior, so he's got some training age, and his progress should be slowing down. And he came in, popped his shoes off, took his coat off, and he jumped like I want to say it was like a 2-inch PR on his vertical jump. No warm-up, no nothing. You know what I mean? So, like, to me, that's pretty fucking good. If you're a junior and you're in this system and you walk in and take your coat off and your shoes off and jump a 2-inch, same thing. We had a thrower do the same thing. He came in, changed his, he was supposed to, they were doing lower body. So he came in, he went to the office, put his squat shoes on, came out, set up the Vertec, and a 280-pound kid jumped, it was 30 or 32 inches. But either way, it was a decent-sized PR for a kid who, again, was a junior or senior and just kind of walked in with barely any fucking warm-up and jumped PR. So things like that, you know, kind of speak to that. Okay.